from Spotify, who hopefully many of you know. Spotify has been a company that many have looked to learn from and potentially even emulate. So it'll be very interesting to hear what Cliff has to say. Welcome.
Cool, can everyone hear me? Sweet. Oh, you don't have a headset? Okay, I can stand over here, maybe you can hear me. Cool. It's great to be here in Israel. It's my first time. I've been enjoying it. I've had a couple of days. Been around in Tel Aviv. I went up to Jerusalem for one night. It's been really awesome. You have some amazing food, some very interesting people, and some wonderful beaches. It's been really, really cool. So thank you for having me. Yeah, thank you. I must be honest, it's a little bit odd talking to a bunch of headsets. It is kind of a strange setup, but I guess it'll be okay. So if you think something's funny, then laugh extra loud. If you want to get my attention, wave extra. It'll be cool to have some feedback from you as well. So, cool. So before I start, I'm curious, how many of you know of Spotify as a company? Cool. How many of you are using Spotify? Cool. And how many of those are paying for Spotify? 2 hands. Awesome. Cool. So I jokingly say if you really like the talk, then you can pay for Spotify, and then next year I can come back again. So it should be good. There's ways around that, although that's off the record.
Tell us more.
Cool. So I came up with the idea for this talk because after having been to a couple of conferences, I found a lot of people asking me questions about Spotify, and what I wanted to do was try to maybe dispel some of the myths and sort of misconceptions that people have, and try to fill in some of the things that I think have not really been presented as clearly in the papers and in the videos and so on. So maybe you've seen some of the videos, you've read some of the papers, you've heard about Spotify. A lot of people are talking about what we're doing. And I want to kind of open with just a little bit of a quick touch on partly what I'm referring to, and then I'll get into kind of the details. So how many of you have seen this picture? Quite a few hands. Okay. It's a little bit old in that there's quite a few things that are different to this, and that's kind of the point of my talk. So roughly this is a way that we were organizing ourselves pretty much exclusively in 2012, as you can see up at the top there. There's a whole bunch of things that are not on here that we do today, and there's a lot of stuff, as I said, that is perhaps left out because of the fact that it's hard to condense an entire company into one sheet of paper or into a single video. But the thing to take away from this is basically that it's maybe a somewhat joking sort of saying, but it says all models are wrong, some of them are useful. And the point of this is basically that things are contextually specific. Something that works in our context may not work in yours. A model that applies to a certain type of scenario may not work in others. You need to kind of apply some thinking, basically use things if they make sense, but also be aware that not everything is useful in all contexts, right? And then 2 little sub-points there is that it's really just a snapshot. So anything that I tell you today will probably be different in a few weeks' time. Our company changes really fast. We're growing really quickly. To give you an indication, we're doubling in employee count roughly every 9 months. So it's pretty rapid. We're about 2,500 people today. So it's pretty big. And there's a lot of challenges that come with that. There's a lot of new things that we have to deal with that come up from time to time. So keep that in mind. And the second little sub-point there is that there's a lot of variety. I don't work everywhere in the company. There's quite a few people, so I see certain parts of it. And those who try to capture things will talk about things that are maybe more commonly used, but are not universally applied, if that makes sense. So does that make sense? You with me so far? Okay. Cool. So the point of my talk today is basically to tell you about some of the things that we avoid doing rather than the things that we actually do. Why we avoid them, so I'll try to give an explanation of that, and also what we try to do instead of those things, because I think that part of what's conveyed in our videos and our talks in the past is very much, here are the things that we do, and I think what's actually really interesting is the little things sort of behind the scenes that maybe you don't realize we're not doing, which I think in many cases actually create some of the systemic conditions that we have inside the organization that are perhaps unique to us. Last time, hopefully, that I ask you to raise your hand, how many of you know this picture? Have you seen this before? Cool. I won't get into too much theory and background on this, but this is a model called Cynefin. It's a complexity thinking model. If you think of it as sort of systems taken to the next level, sort of systems thinking, I don't know if 2.0 is the right way to put it, but basically an evolution of that. Roughly what it is that if you take systems theory and you divide systems into ordered and unordered systems, you have ordered systems over here and unordered systems on this side, right? And they behave differently. So the point I'm trying to get across is that this is really not the space that we're describing. It's not things that are in the obvious space, things where you can copy and paste a best practice. It's much more up in this space. Things where you have good practice basically being where it's applicable in certain contexts, and emergent practice being things that you discover kind of as you go and will iterate on as you go. I'm not going to go into too much more detail about this, but if you'd like to talk about this, I'm happy to talk about this afterwards. The person who invented, if you will, this is called Dave Snowden, and the model is called Cynefin, spelled with a C-Y-N-E-F-I-N. It's Welsh, it's weird. But yeah, have a look. There's a lot of great videos on YouTube. It's a really fascinating way of approaching different things, and has helped me to solve some of the problems that I've encountered in organizational context. There you go. I have to point it at the thing. So culture is basically, it's something that I think is really important. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is about the culture, but I really want to emphasize this point that it's necessary, but it's not the only thing that you need, right? You do still need some processes, you do still need some rules, you do still need some people, you need a bunch of different things. So don't treat this as an entire complete picture, right? Before I get into the details of the talk, I want to give you just a little bit of a background. So if you can imagine for me that you're at Spotify head office in Stockholm where I work. It's Sweden, so it's probably cold. It's summer right now, so it's actually light until 11:30 at night. It's a little bit of a strange climate. It takes a little bit of getting used to. It's pretty awesome once you're used to it. It doesn't get anywhere near as warm as here, but it is very cool. I'm originally from South Africa, which is almost the opposite end of the planet, and there we don't have seasons, and Sweden has some of the most widely varied seasons of anywhere in the world. So there's a lot of things that are very different. But I want you to imagine that you're sitting inside the Spotify head office, and give me a few minutes to kind of paint you a picture of what it's like to be there, just so that you can sort of see some of the things that are happening. So this is a picture. This is actually up on the top floor of the building in our cafeteria. We were basically doing an onboarding for a bunch of people. These were all new people to the company. It's funny to say new people because this is more than 2 years ago. Yeah, basically just doing an exercise. You can see he's having a lot of fun. Quite a few other people. Basically, this is just hanging out, learning about flow. Something that is, we dedicate 2 weeks of people's time. Every new person who joins the company spends 2 weeks going through a process of learning about how the company works. They will ship some code multiple times during the course of those 2 weeks into production. They will demonstrate what they've built. They will work in a team environment. They will give each other feedback. All of these kind of things. It's a really cool way to get to know the company. So I don't know if you can make out this picture, but it's essentially a bunch of boring IT equipment, things like mouse pads and network cables and monitor cables and so on. What you can't see in this picture is that this is actually placed in a fairly public space right at the entrance to the office on one of the floors. And it sits right next to the IT service desk. And basically what happens here is that there's a bunch of equipment that is placed there, anything from an iPhone charger to a new mouse or whatever. If you need something, you just go down and fetch it. No forms to sign, nobody's permission to ask. Just go and fetch it, get back to doing what you were doing, right? There is obviously a bit of a requisitions process for some of the more complicated equipment, but that's also very, very easy to do. And if it doesn't work for you, take your credit card, buy it, and expense it. You'll get your money back. Something I want to emphasize about this, which is something that I find interesting, because a lot of people see this picture and they go, "Wow, that's so amazing! You trust your employees so much." I said, "Well, there's actually another story behind this, and it's called Project Lollipop." One day at one of the all hands, the person who runs the procurement process, he got up and he said, "I was doing some math and I built a spreadsheet, and I calculated how much money we've spent on MacBook charges over the last few months, and then I cried a little bit, and that's why I'm here talking to you today. So, and he pulls out this big box of lollipops, and he says, I realize we've got a lot of spare equipment obviously lying around in the office, so I have this box of lollipops. If you bring me anything, a monitor, a mouse, a keyboard, a MacBook charger, a spare laptop, I will give you a lollipop. And I spoke to him a couple of weeks later, and he said that is the highest return on investment of any box of lollipops in the history of lollipops, and probably will remain that way for the rest of today, or the rest of time. What I think is interesting about this is that a lot of companies that I've worked at in the past would take the approach of putting rules in place. Very, very strict approach, very blunt hammer, basically. Hit it like we can. If we just spend enough time, we can whack a mole and get rid of all of the things that people are doing that are a little bit weird. But there are other ways to get people to do things that are helpful and beneficial to the company. Simple incentive. I mean, a lollipop is worth nothing. Like, I could buy a lollipop much faster than I can take a spare monitor down to IT. But it just creates that awareness. People will do things naturally if you remove the obstacles, I think. I include this one just because I like it. This is one of our company values. And it says, think it, build it, ship it, and it normally says tweak it, but for a few months it says twerk it instead. And every time this got cleaned away, a few days later it would be back, someone would put it up again. Yeah, what I like about it is that there's this sense of humor and just kind of, we are who we are. We're not trying to pretend to be a fancy corporate company. We make streaming music, we build a fantastic service, and we like to have fun while we do it. And I think it's cool when you can see this kind of stuff around the office. You can also see over here, one of the people who works there is actually a graffiti artist in his spare time, and you'll find these random places in meeting rooms. It's his tag, and he just scribbles it and sticks it all around the building. It's thousands of them probably. It's kind of crazy. This is during office hours. How many of you believe me? Only a few hands. So this is, our office is kind of built like if you imagine a really tall donut, there's kind of a hole in the middle. This is part of the hole in the middle. And one of the things that's cool about it is we have a bunch of fake palm trees because we don't have real ones. I think they would die in the cold or something. But we have these like hammocks and some bean bags and some chairs, a barbecue, space, table tennis, all of that. And quite often people will go out and sit there. So these two are actually, this guy is the manager of this guy, and they're actually having a one-on-one. Just hanging out. I found this left in one of the meeting rooms. It's a problem in coffee goes into the engineer, and the output is a solution, and a byproduct or a side effect is sarcasm. It's pretty common around Spotify to find a lot of funny post-it notes and just random drawings, people who kind of put stuff up. There's a lot of just people being themselves. And I think that's what's really important about it, is that we've tried to sort of underneath all of the stuff that I will talk to you about today, create this idea that, you know, let your human side shine through. Let yourself be a person. You know, Sweden has an interesting culture in the sense that there are a large number of social benefits which, you know, are, I think, quite fascinating in a number of ways. So, for example, one of the things that Sweden has is parental leave for both parents for 6 months, fully paid, each time you have a kid. Each of them get this, and they can take it anywhere up to the first 5 years of the child's life. All right? And we've now changed that, and you can do it globally. So anyone who works for Spotify, any country in the world, gets that benefit. And these kind of things are pretty awesome, right? I won't say it again later, but we are hiring. That's my little pitch on the side. But yeah, I think there's a lot of things that come in this sort of a way of like really trying to exhibit and you see it. It's not just something that I'm telling you. Like, these are things that we actually do in practice. Taking time to respect humans and treat them well. So one more story before I get into the details. So I want to tell you a story of learning. How many of you know of the company Toyota? Everybody knows Toyota, basically. How many of you know that Toyota used to make weaving machines? A couple of hands. They've got a long and fascinating history. They've done all kinds of things over the years. Anyway, this story basically comes from, in the early days, they had one of the sort of world's most efficient and effective weaving machines. And one day, one of the fairly senior engineers found out that one of their competitors had stolen the plans for their prized machine, and freaked out. And when he stopped freaking out, he ran to his boss and said, "Competitors have stolen our machines. This is terrible. Like, it's the end of the company." And his boss said to him, "Why? I don't see the point. Like, what's the problem?" He's like, "But they've got our plans." It's like, yeah, but let's think about it this way. Let's say maybe 6 months from now or a year from now, they've managed to build one of our machines, right? So now we're a year ahead already. Then it takes them another year before they realize that we've been iterating on this plan. So now we're 2 years ahead, right? We've evolved the model. Plus then another 3 years for them to develop, another year for them to develop the capability to also improve on that model. So now we're still 3 years ahead. A 3-year head start. I mean, if you can't win that race, what's the problem, right? What I think is fascinating about it is that I've had a couple of people say to me, "Why do you come up here and you give away all the secrets about what Spotify is doing?" I say that there's so many different things behind it, but there's also a case of like, we think that there is a lot of benefit to others being able to see some of the things that we're doing because maybe you can draw some inspiration and learn from it. Is it possible to get some water? Cool. Sorry, I'm sure it's loud if I cough in the headset, so my coughing is right next to your head. So, while I'm really not advocating for anybody to copy what we're doing, I do think that it is helpful to draw inspiration. And if that inspires you to do something different and to change the way that you do work and that makes your life better, then go for it. But make sure that you take the time to think about what you're doing and test when it works and when it doesn't. Excellent. I have 2 hands, that's great. Cool. So, in a nutshell, when I think about Spotify, really what we're trying to do is we're trying to be the best at getting better, right? I like it because it kind of just captures it in a nice little sentence. And some of the thinking behind this is that if you think about our company, we're 2,500 people. If we only have sort of maybe 20 or so people up at the top of the company doing all the thinking and decision making, we're missing out on an enormous amount of potential in the rest of the company, right? And that's not even getting into the space of can those people actually know what's going on or what the best decision is. So what we want to try to do, and a lot of this is sort of centered around that, is we want to try to create an organization where everybody can be involved in the work. Does it make sense? So, how many of you have a situation where you've had a mistake that you've made or a problem that has occurred, and you know that it's your head is essentially on the block? And how do you feel? Like if you think about like going to the company or going to your boss or your manager and telling them about what's happened, how does that make you feel? Excited? Ready to go? No? The opposite. Pretty terrible. Yeah? It's not so much fun. I think the part of the problem with punishing failure is that people tend to do a number of different things. Like, how many of you would maybe wait a little bit longer? You'd put it off until the last minute. Avoid it if you can. Maybe try to hide it. Oh, it's not that big a failure. We'll just, put it here. No one will notice. All of these kind of things start to happen. And if you're trying to build an organization that can respond to change, you need to actually deal with the real information, not an imaginary, fictitious presented layer over the top, right? So if you create this environment where you're punishing people for making small mistakes or some sort of innocent failure, all the way through to massive catastrophes, you really just end up in a situation where you're not dealing with the real information. Things will arrive late. You'll lose great people for strange things that really, they just cost you $1 million, and now they know the lesson. They're never going to make that mistake again. Why would you throw them out the door? That doesn't make sense to me. You've already paid for their learning. You're going to pay twice. Get rid of them as well. I want to distinguish between two types of failure, though, because I think it's quite important, and a lot of people react quite strangely when I suggest this idea. But the idea is that there is negligent and non-negligent, right? So willful failure, like I just ignored a previous learning, or I made the mistake 500 times, or I just, we know that there are certain things that are just stupid. Just don't do them, right? Anything in that category, I think you need to deal with, and you need to deal with it quite seriously, and perhaps even harshly. I'm not suggesting that you should let somebody continue to break things for the rest of time. If somebody is clearly incompetent at their job, you need to change things. However, if people are scared of taking risks and they're worried about the consequences of saying, hey, actually, I don't think this thing is a good idea based on a bunch of information. I happen to also maybe be an expert in that area, or I've been working on this thing for 25 years. I know what's going on. Maybe you want to listen to them. And if you build an organization that prevents that kind of thing from emerging, you're just not going to hear about it. You're not going to be able to have those conversations. So a lot of companies, it looks a little bit more like this. I don't think that that's super helpful. I like to think about it like this, is that every organization is basically, it is perfectly designed for the results it's currently achieving. So if your company is in a situation where everything that comes out is garbage, it's not the people, it's the whole organization that's to blame. Think about it as a whole system, right? Whatever's coming out is the result of the way you've structured and built, hired, everything. It's a byproduct of your organization. Don't blame the individuals. So what do we do instead? We try to build trust and celebrate learning. A lot of people in the lean startup community will talk about this idea of celebrate failure. I think that's a good start, but it doesn't take it quite to the point where you need to get it to, because celebrating a failure doesn't necessarily mean that you learnt anything from it. You need to celebrate the learning, not just the failure. Maybe you need to celebrate failure to get people comfortable with being okay with it, but at some point you're going to have to go beyond that. There's a little story that I tell. One of the engineers was actually great because Josh was talking about some of these things this morning in the sort of concept of safety. And he told a story about a bunch of different failures. His example was from Etsy. I could tell you probably 200 different stories of this kind of thing from Spotify. But I was working with one team, and we had this engineer that had just started. He'd been with the company probably about a week. And sometimes when you have this sense that like things are just a little bit too quiet and something's not right. And I turn around and I see this guy, and he looked like he was sweating, and he's normally a pretty relaxed dude. Something is clearly not right. So I'm like, hey, what's going on? He says, I think I just killed all of Spotify. Like, what do you mean? He's like, I was doing something and now everything's gone. Turns out it was only about 10% of Spotify Europe. It wasn't that big a deal. He'd made a change to some network configurations, and it had gone out into production. He thought he was on the test environment. He'd only been there about a week. He didn't know. Also, the permissions were set in a weird way. It shouldn't have been possible to do what he'd actually done. But he was panicking and freaking out about this. He's like, I'm going to get fired, and I only just got here. I just moved from another country. First thing he did after a little bit of poking and encouragement was to jump onto the Slack channel and start a conversation with some of the other engineers. The first thing somebody says, dude, don't worry about it. We've all done this 1,000 times. Right? Somebody starts coming out with like, maybe we can fix this, maybe we can do it that way. A couple of minutes later, they fixed the problem, rolled everything back. A few minutes, somebody couldn't listen to the latest Beyonce. It's not the end of the world, but something we want to try to avoid, so we extract the learning. And immediately what happens is everybody starts sharing stories about, you remember the time when I did this, and you remember the time when we did that, and you remember the time that this happened, right? The culture where people feel comfortable to be able to do that. Encouraging that sort of behavior, I think, is really helpful, specifically when you can talk about the learning. The next one. How many of you work in a company that has sort of like a bonus, performance bonuses or something like that? Yeah? It's quite common, I think. So at Spotify, we don't have any of that. We have no performance bonuses, nobody in the company anyway, with the exception of sales who earn commission, which we'll leave that one alone for now. But nobody, not the CEO, not the CFO, none of the engineers, nobody gets a performance bonus. We pay people enough to take the issue of money off the table, and that's it, right? The problem that I think we find when we start having performance bonuses or like excessive individual recognition is that it starts to build this sort of cult of a hero. Each person is somehow more important, or that person is especially unique, right? And yes, you want to celebrate individuality and people's uniqueness and so on, but if you put somebody on a pedestal, you actually disincentivize the other people from playing their part in the company as well. It starts to hinder collaboration. So there's a story from a company that I used to work at. I was doing some consulting work back in South Africa. And the one day I arrived in the office and there were a bunch of inflatable stars suspended over a bunch of the desks. And I said to one of the engineers, I said, "What's going on here?" And he sort of laughs, whatever, this is just ridiculous. I said, "No, seriously, like what's happening?" He says, "No, every 6 months, each team gets to nominate one person who is the star performer. They get this little star over their head for about a week, and then they get some little prize." I said, "Oh, okay, so how do you decide who's the winner?" He says, "Oh, well, in our team, actually, we've figured it out." He says, I'm like, "Oh, what do you do?" He says, "No, we have a little Excel sheet, and we literally rotate it around. One time it's you, one time it's you, one time it's you. New person joins, they get to go to the bottom of the list." I said, "Sounds brilliant. Do you think it's achieving the goal that the company was intending to?" It's like, "Nope." Went and asked a couple of other teams, similar kind of situation, but there were a couple, far and away, the vast majority of them, was this kind of dynamic of either they'd gamed it or they were frustrated with the system. I did something awesome, but that person got the reward because their thing was more visible, right? It doesn't incentivize the type of collaboration that you're actually looking for. Now, I'm not saying don't ever recognize people for their performance or for doing good things, but when you build a culture where the only time you recognize them is once every 6 months, and you do it in some sort of false way like this, it can definitely create the wrong behavior. So avoid the hero worship. If you think about it, it's basically because of this. If you look inside a team, right? If you think about a football team, for example, football's a bit of a hot topic at the moment, but let's say the team plays the entire game, the goalie didn't score any goals, right? He's in his box, guarding, right? Nobody even took a strike because the defenders were doing such a great job, the ball never even made it down that part of the field. When they win the trophy at the end of the season, do you think the goalie gets told, "No, you didn't actually do anything, you don't get to He's as much part of the team as anybody else, right? I think you need to think about it in this way, is that so often people have different types of interactions with the environment. They could have a catalyzing effect, they could be doing something that's not visible, and trying to associate it with this very strict, like, these are the 3 things that we will recognize as performance, you end up in a problematic situation. So what we try to do is encourage collaboration and celebration of team success, right? So you live or die as a team. You succeed or fail as a team, right? If the team does something, they did it together. Maybe I wasn't working on that exact thing, but because I was doing this thing over here, it meant that these people could do that, right? We work together, we share the success. Something that I think is particularly helpful if you're trying to work in this sort of an environment and you're trying to encourage collaboration is that you're probably going to need a healthy dose of this. It's very hard to know how much collaboration is helpful or not helpful, what type of collaboration would be useful when, if you're not having regular feedback loops. And there's a variety of different things that we do, and if you're interested, we can talk about it in some more detail when I take questions at the end. The third and final one is, and I think this is a very significant one, is to avoid centralizing all decisions and information. I spoke earlier about the 20 people at the top versus the 2,500 people at the edges of the organization. There's this really great quote from Don Reinertsen. Basically what he's saying here is that if you want to decentralize decision making, you have to move the information to the part of the organization that needs to make that decision, right? And very often what we see happen is you say, "Oh, you're a self-organizing team, off you go," and then the management go over here and drink cocktails or do whatever it is that they're doing. that's not particularly helpful, because there is contextual information that somebody in the CEO position or even in the first line of management position has. You can see things across the organization, you have access to other information. Try to find the right information and funnel it to where it needs to be in order to help supporting decisions. I think it's really, really important. So what we try to do instead is encourage leadership and responsibility at all levels, right? And there's a really great talk by, how many of you know of Esther Darby? I find it quite interesting because I mentioned her to a couple of people over lunch and I got a similar reaction, maybe half a hand here and there. She's a wonderful lady, does these talks about all kinds of fascinating things. She's written a bunch of books on Agile retrospectives and coaching teams. She has a fantastic talk called Leadership at All Levels. And in that talk, she talks about, I'll touch on it a little bit just now, but she talks about a couple of examples that of what leaders can do in an organization to try to get leadership at all levels. Some of the things that I think that is become the responsibility of leadership is basically the mentorship and coaching and development of individuals within the organization, as well as working with the clarity, conditions, and constraints within the organization, which I'll touch on in a little bit more detail. And specifically with that funnel of information. You don't want to be a bottleneck or a handoff, but if you hear about something over here that could be beneficial to these people over there, help that information to connect, whether by connecting those two individuals, or by connecting those teams, or by creating some sort of channel through which that information can flow. How many of you have experienced something like this? I don't know if you can see well at the back there. Yeah? I think it's a pretty common thing in a lot of companies that I've encountered. You end up in a lot of situations, and we've done our bits, we've thought of this great idea, now you have to go and make it happen. It is really, really, really important that you start to, with that collaboration, help people within the organization, not only those inside the team, but those around the team, to take responsibility for the work that they need to be doing. Pay attention to the things that need to be paid attention to. So I said I would touch briefly on this idea of conditions, clarity, and constraints. So the first one is around attending to clarity. And specifically what this is talking about, do people know what to do, what's important, and why, right? If people don't know what that is, doesn't mean you have to tell them. They need to be able to figure it out, right? They need an answer to that question. If people don't know what to do, it's a very uncertain and unsafe space to be in. It can be confusing as hell. If you think about it, I put a little asterisk here and said that clarity is different to detail, right? Very often what I see happen is you end up in a situation where people are unclear what to do, and so the manager comes in and spells out, we're going to do this, 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 right? There's a big difference between saying to people, find a way to cross the river and build a boat. Those two are very, very different from each other, yeah? The second one is to establish the conditions. Can you still hear me okay? Okay. This is where the headsets come in an advantage, yeah. What we mean by the conditions is basically giving people the means to be able to do the work, right? That can be anything from the culture to the physical environment, maybe to access to equipment, all of these kind of things, right? It's so important. If you don't have the right environment, the right space for people to do it, you haven't hired the right skills, all of these things, you're not going to end up in a very healthy space. And the final one is to design appropriate constraints. And if you think about it as this, basically, it's the limits or boundaries within your organization or your system, right? Things like what should always be done, what should never be done, In our case, for example, we have regulation around privacy of information, for example. We know that we're not supposed to do these things ever, otherwise, it's illegal and we will get sued on a practical level. But it's also a violation of trust of our customers and our users, right? There are maybe things that we expect people to always do, right? Treat each other with respect, right? No discrimination, these kind of behaviors. It's a good idea if people are aware of what these are and that you take care to design them in a way that is appropriate to your organization. last thing just on the constraints is that this is something that I think is quite fascinating. Is it's more common for companies to die of indigestion than starvation, right? And basically what this means is that you end up in a situation where you're trying to do everything and then it doesn't go so well, so you try to do everything times 2. Have you ever been in this situation? I've never been in a situation where I only have one thing to do a week. It would be a fantastic situation to be in. But one of the things that I think as leaders in an organization you have the opportunity to do is to help the organization focus, right? Pick the things that are important. It's so incredibly important. Cool. So the three things that I think are key out of this is basically to celebrate the learning, encourage the collaboration, and support leadership at all levels. And very often when I suggest these ideas, I hear this. Have you ever heard this? I don't know if you've ever worked in a company. Oh, but our situation is special. It's a little bit different. To me, that sounds a little bit like this cat over here. Yeah? You met these kind of people before? So the 3 common things that I hear are people saying, you know, if people won't do work unless we tell them what to do. And I think this is predicated on the assumption that you've basically got dead wood inside your company, if that analogy makes sense. And my response to that is that if you have dead wood, there's really only 2 ways that it got there, right? Either you hired it, you either hired dead wood, or you hired Livewood and you killed it, right? It's the only way that it got there. It's 2 fairly simple solutions to both of those. Teaching, training, mentoring, learning, all of these things, they're too expensive. You know? What if we train people and they leave? Well, what if you don't and they stay? Yeah? And the last one, which Josh also touched on a little bit earlier, we don't have time to change the way we work, or we don't have time to do that. And to that I say, you know, change is not essential, but then again, neither is survival. So you have a choice. So if you're wondering maybe, so how can I be the best, or how can I get better at getting better, right? I have 3 things that I think you could do, that you could start doing tomorrow. Start with small safe-to-fail experiments, right? Very often in a situation, I've done training courses and people come to me and they say, right, so you've given us all these ideas of Scrum or Kanban or whatever, we're going to go and implement it all tomorrow. That's the old way of thinking. Big bang approaches. That's waterfall. That's not agile, right? Use agile to go agile. Start with what you do now and iterate going forwards. You don't have to have a revolution for every new idea. Yeah? If you want to build trust with your team in order to be able to do good work, you're going to have to go first. You can't tell people, you must trust me. If you don't trust your employees, they're never going to trust you. Yeah? And the third one, go to the gemba. The gemba is a Japanese word meaning literally the place of work or where the work happens. Go and look where the work happens. Go and see the people. Go and see what's on the ground. Go and understand reality, not from the executive office or from your desk, wherever that is. Go and interact with the humans who are doing the work on the ground and go and see what is there. And the 4th point that I snuck in, there's a great quote by Charlie Munger, who is the other person behind Warren Buffett. He's the brains of Berkshire Hathaway. He says, I never met a person who was successful who didn't read constantly. These are 4 books that I would recommend. They're all different and great in unique ways. And if you enjoy them, you can find me on Twitter and you can say hello. And we can talk about how awesome they were and what you liked about them. So thank you very much.